Good morning. I'm Sherman Stanford, and this is Making Sense of the Chaos. And I hope that this morning we'll be able to make a little bit more sense of the chaos. We've been discussing eschatology, which is the study of the last things, the end times. We've discussed amillennialism, which is the idea that there really is no thousand-year rule and reign of Jesus on earth before the judgment day. And we've discussed historic premillennialism, which is somewhat like dispensational premillennialism, but not quite the same. And we've discussed dispensational premillennialism. And today, I'll finish up with that, but very briefly, and then I'm going to give you a brief historical overview, and I'm not sure how brief it'll be. There's a lot that goes into this, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. First, though, the purpose of my book is not to make a painstaking point-by-point refutation of faulty belief systems. What I'm trying to do is give you a broad overview of ideas and how they affect Christianity, how they affect the world, but specifically how they affect Christianity and Christians, you and me. Because let me explain something to you, which you may not have thought about, but you'll have to admit is true. Every step that you take all day long on every path that you walk is always first framed by your idea of something or other. Well, what does that mean? Well, you're not going to get up to go get a glass of water unless you first think that getting up to go get a glass of water is a good idea. If you think it's a bad idea, you won't go do it. Well, I don't think in terms of it as an idea at all. I'm just thirsty. I understand that. But whether you think of it in terms of an idea, it comes as an idea in your head. Okay, you may feel thirst, but feeling thirst that's not interpreted by your brain as get up and go get water will leave you sitting there until you die of thirst. Does that make sense? Now, if even getting up to go get a glass of water can only happen because you respond to an idea in your mind, then clearly ideas are the most fundamental things to understand that motivate human behavior. And since everybody does, all day long, always comes out of one idea or another, making sure the ideas that contribute to the things we do are correct is probably a pretty good idea in itself, don't you think? So that's what I'm trying to do with this book. I'm trying to give you understanding of the ideas that have motivated people to do the things they do, both for God and against God, for God's people and against God's people. This is the whole idea behind my work here. And that's what I'm trying to teach you. Because if you don't understand these ideas, it doesn't mean they won't influence you. It means that they'll influence you and you won't understand what to expect, and you'll be surprised by the results that occur after you do whatever, because you hadn't anticipated that. I don't think that's a good enough excuse, because you see, the stuff that exists between your left ear and your right ear, what we call a brain, your mind, was given to you by God for a purpose. All right? It wasn't just to create a nice edifice to put your cap on backwards, or whatever way you want to wear it, sideways. Some people do that. So anyway, that's what we're doing. Now, eschatology represents ideas about what to expect in the future. And what to expect in the future, what you think the future is going to look like, will determine to a large extent how you walk today. It's true. Can't get around that. So getting these ideas right is important. Now, a system of belief that requires jury rigging for support disqualifies itself from serious consideration by thoughtful people. Now, I have demonstrated out of the Bible and with sound argumentation that the basis, I mean, we looked at the three assumptions of dispensational premillennialism, and we showed they are all demonstrably false. Now, if the three assumptions that support the entire system are false, and you choose nevertheless to continue to believe in the system, you got a problem. And it's not my fault, because I showed you they're false. Now, what you do about it, that's up to you, between you and God. I play no part in that. But my job is to tell you what's true. What you do with that, it's up to you. But the entire trajectory of the Bible, from Genesis 3:15 onward, shows the progressive growth of God's grace and mercy, working through God's children, overcoming the world, Satan's children, the seed of the serpent. It is the message of growing oneness of the seed of the woman, Christians, with God. Not God's growing oneness with a huge parenthetical splinter. There are only two seeds, the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman. That's it. That's it. Dispensational premillennialism would tell you they're really, well, you know, yeah, there are only two seeds, but there's a huge division between part of the first seed and the other part of the first seed. No, that's not true. That's not what God tells us. It's not true. It is a system that has been grafted onto the Bible. It is not a system that came out of the Bible. No. Dispensationalism, together with its eschatological child, dispensational premillennialism, is not merely implausible, it is preposterous. Now, that's my considered opinion. You're free to reject it if you want. If you think I've made a mistake, I have a Facebook account. You can address me directly on that Facebook account, or you can send it to my email account, calvinistrunner@gmail.com. Now we're going to have a brief historical overview of the rise of dispensational premillennialism. And we need to look at history a little more broadly than just today, okay? In fact, as broadly as we can. This is a really, really simple issue, and it's a really, really complex issue at the same time. Well, how can that be? Well, because, simply put, everything that happens in the world is an outworking of the conflict between the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman. Everything. You can call it between the good people and the bad people. You can say between the rebels and the submissive, faithful ones to God. You can couch it any way you'd like. But that is the framework for all of human history. That's what's going on. Now, the one way to see the seed of the serpent is, and its teachings, this is humanism. Humanism flows out of the seed of the serpent. And humanism has been the opponent of faithful theism, that is, believing in God, from the Garden of Eden onward. And it is today. There is a constant battle between these two. The battle takes on many different forms. It has many different strains. It looks many different ways in different ages, even in the same age. When you walk out of your house, when you turn on the television, when you look at what's going on in the world around you, it can be very, very confusing. And it is, because there's so many different ideas that are coming at you from so many different directions. But if you understand that there are really only two basic categories from which these ideas are coming, you're either hearing something that's consistent with God's word, or you're hearing something that's not. And if it's not consistent with God's word, then it is mixed, at least, at the very best, it's mixed with man's word, and it's polluted. It's polluted. it's the stuff of the seed of the serpent. And so you have to sift out these two things. Now, if you're going to do this, of course, you must start with the presumption that God's word is the sole infallible source of authority for your life. It doesn't mean it's the only authority, it's the sole infallible authority. Does that make sense? You know, when your boss tells you to do something, he has authority over you. But his authority is not infallible. It's authority, however, and you have to obey, or you can leave your job. That's true. Now, you don't have that choice with God. You don't have the choice of, well, I'll obey God, or I'll just check out. I'll leave the job. I'll go live in this other area. I'll go live in this neutral area that's not subject to God's jurisdiction. There is no such area. There's only God's world. There is no other world that you can live in. Okay? And so everything has been a conflict between these two basic concepts, these two groups of humanity. Understanding and explaining how such a deeply flawed eschatological position could have gained wide acceptance and support over the last 175 to 200 years may be treading where wise men fear to go. But it is important to try to understand where we are in the flow of history. Because history is, in fact, like a flowing stream. It is not enough to mark the bank on the side of the boat to establish our location. The stream both came from somewhere and is going somewhere else. To properly understand where we are at any time requires some notion of where we came from. Once we have generally ascertained where we came from, we understand better where we are, and we improve our understanding of where we may be going. Hopefully, a broad overview will be helpful in piercing the fog of history. And it is quite confusing, especially if you don't keep in mind these two basic divisions of humanity, this fundamental conflict. As with all sweeping generalizations, it will be simple while risking being simplistic, but it is offered only as a paradigm through which to see shadowy outlines emerge into fairly solid form from the incredibly intricate mosaic of literally countless individual and group ideas and actions that constitute any period of history. A key to understanding the wide acceptance of dispensationalism and its premillennial eschatology lies in the timing of its appearance. It first appeared about 190 years ago. Not coincidentally, it was about 200 to 225 years ago that German theological scholarship began eroding the self-confidence of the Christian religious establishment. Across denominational lines, with its assumptions, with its naturalistic rationalism, calling into question many of the supernatural assumptions long held about God and His Word. Also, not coincidentally, it was at about this same time that, as an outgrowth of modernism and its rationalistic epistemology, the scientific community became much more receptive to naturalistic assumptions challenging the supernatural cosmology and ontology widely accepted previously. Now that's a mouthful, right? I'll just leave that line like a rock. No, I think maybe I need to explain a lot of that, don't you think? All right, what is modernism? Well, modernism grew out of the Enlightenment, and the Enlightenment grew out of a sort of melding of the Renaissance and the Reformation. I've just complicated matters further for you, right? Well, the Renaissance occurred probably in the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries. It's a broad movement, and it's often looked back on by secular scholars as a breaking free of the cramping strictures of the Roman Catholic Church. And there's a sense in which that's true. What it was a revival of antiquity, ideas from antiquity, especially from Greece. It was a revival of philosophical ideas, artistic ideas, cultural ideas, social ideas. But it was not Christian in any way. The Greeks were not Christians. And so in the philosophical arena, this was a flowering of Platonism and Aristotelianism, because Plato and Aristotle were the two most significant Greek philosophers. In fact, Thomas Aquinas, who was a Roman Catholic theologian, in his Summa Theologica, he tried to meld Platonism and Aristotelianism with Christianity. Mostly he was Aristotelian. But he tried to bring in natural theology, that is, the unbelieving philosophies of the Greeks, into the Christian faith. And there's a limited utility in that. But it ended up bringing humanism into the faith in a larger degree than it had before. Now, the next major development was the Reformation. And the Reformation was, first of all, it was a freeing of the church from its humanistic incrustations, and a return to the Bible as the authority and the sole authority for faith and practice, the sole infallible authority for faith and practice for the church and for all Christians. But it also embodied systematic thinking. Okay? It was very rational. Now, that rationalism of the Reformation was then borrowed, stolen by secular scholars, and melded the Reformation thinking with the method of thinking that had been demonstrated by the Reformers, with thinking from the Greeks, represented by the Renaissance, into what became the Enlightenment. Now, the Enlightenment had a left wing and a right wing to it. The left wing is personified by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was a despicable human being. And he lived in the 1700s, died probably, 15 years or so before the French Revolution. I'm not certain of the time exactly, but before the French Revolution. But his ideas flowered in the French Revolution. The French Revolution was an example of the left wing of the Enlightenment. On the other hand, John Locke was the personification of the right wing of the Enlightenment. Now, the truth is that the Enlightenment generally was fatally flawed by humanism on the left and the right, but it was much more seriously flawed by humanistic assumptions on the left than on the right. And John Locke's view of reality, as he expressed it in his writings, and that strain of the Enlightenment, was represented in the American Revolution, the thinkers of the American Revolution. It was a lot more consistent with Christianity, and so that's why the American Revolution was a very different animal from the French Revolution, producing a very different result. And it was, except for the battle against Britain in order to gain independence, it was largely a peaceful enterprise. There was no Civil War aspect to the American Revolution. It wasn't Americans fighting with Americans. It was Americans fighting with the British. On the other hand, the French Revolution was an internal fight among Frenchmen, a class fight And we still see that same sort of thinking. It came forward into Karl Marx and into Nietzsche, into Lenin, into, well, progressivism today. Okay? So, just to give you a little idea. Now, because the Enlightenment was essentially a rejection, a tacit rejection at best, and sometimes an open and overt rejection of Christian principles, of the Christian religion, of God himself, it found it necessary to frame an alternative ontology, cosmology, and epistemology. Now, we've discussed those earlier, and I know those words sound complicated, but the ideas behind them are very ordinary, and everybody has some notion of a cosmology, an ontology, and an epistemology. A cosmology means, what is your explanation for how everything came into existence? Now, everybody has some idea of that, even if they say, well, it was always that way, it's just always been this way. That's still a cosmology, all right? The question is not whether you have a cosmology. The question is whether it makes sense, whether it is rational, whether it is consistent, whether it is arbitrary or not, right? Whether it is internally consistent, whether it can account for itself, its own presuppositions. Now, an ontology is the question of how did being come into existence? Human beings, any being, okay? And everybody has some idea of that as well, even if the best they can do is to say, well, human beings have always existed, or evolution, or whatever, or God, okay? And epistemology is the question of how can we know anything reliably? How can we be sure that anything that we know can be trusted? And everybody has some idea of that because everybody trusts to some degree the things they believe they know. Even when people say, well, we really can't know anything. That is so absurd on the face of it. Because when he's telling you that he can know nothing, he is telling you that he knows that he can know nothing. He's contradicting his very statement in giving the statement. Does that make sense? So your epistemology, like your cosmology and like your ontology, has to make sense. Naturalistic cosmology, epistemology, and ontology are based on randomness, pure chance. Because except for God, there is no other where to go. There's no other place to go. Wherever you try to put the source of your cosmology or your ontology or your epistemology apart from God, it will end up being in pure chance. Because you can't anchor it in man. Man is inadequate. That's what philosophers have discovered. It's very clear. And it wouldn't take me long to expose that for anybody who's claiming that those kinds of certainties can be found in man. It doesn't take long at all. Anyway, you have to understand that all these things were going on at the time, or had been going on for several hundred years, had been slowly. But most of that had been blunted by the Reformation because the Reformation was a return to God. Okay, so you got these two things going at the same time, as they always do. The seed of the woman, the seed of the serpent. One doesn't vanquish the other completely at any time in history. That's not going to happen until the judgment day. Okay, so these two great agencies of humanity are at work and in conflict at all times since the fall in the garden, and they will be until the judgment day. That's a fact of life. You have to understand that. You have to start with that presupposition, or you'll make sense of nothing. Anyway, these ideas were taking hold in the culture generally, all right? And naturalism, by the way, is the philosophy of men like Carl Sagan, who said that the cosmos is all that ever was, and all that ever will be. Specifically, naturalism explains the world without reference to God, seeking answers to all questions, physical and metaphysical, in the physical world alone, which makes it contradictory at that point, because metaphysical means beyond the physical. Now, if you're limiting reality to the physical cosmos and you're finding answers far beyond the physical cosmos, within the physical cosmos, you're performing a feat of legerdemain that is simply impossible. That means magic. Rationalism originally referred to the attempt to discover truth by reason, which is what the reformers were doing, rather than emotion, but which used as its source of truth, or at least did not rule out as a source of truth, God and his word, the Bible. Over time, the term came to refer to those who use reason alone, anchored in man alone, with God excluded as their source of truth. When I use the word rationalism, I'm talking about the last. That is, that's the idea that we can find the truth by the use of our minds without reference to God. Okay, that's the idea of rationalism in the world today. So when I use that word, that's what I'm talking about. People thinking that they're the ultimate source of truth, they and their minds. Okay? The naturalistic, rationalistic challenge to the supernatural, cosmology, ontology, and epistemology of the Bible was embodied in On the Origin of Species, published by Charles Darwin in 1859. I'm sure you know about Charles Darwin. He was by no means the first scientist to speculate on evolution as the mechanism for the creation of life. But significantly, he was the first to receive broad acceptance. In fact, Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, was known as a transmutationist. Now, the term transmutation is simply a precursor to the term evolution. Okay? It just means the same thing, but it was kind of old-fashioned, so they abandoned that term, but they didn't abandon the concept. The concept is also included in Aristotle's chain of being, by the way, which goes back before the birth of Christ, several centuries. So it's been around a long time, and I don't think Aristotle was the first one who invented it. So to think that Darwin was the first to come up with the idea of evolution is simply nonsense. But he was the person who presented ideas about that at a propitious moment in history when the ground had been plowed and prepared and watered and fertilized. And so when he put those seeds down, they grew immediately. Wow, miracle growth. Wow. When Darwin made his famous observations on his voyage on the Beagle, he was not an impartial observer faithfully recording his findings. He was a man on a mission looking for evidence to support his worldview. Just like we all do. Just like we all do. Everybody does that. And so what you have to do to examine the correctness of your worldview is you have to look at it to see whether it coheres internally and whether it avoids arbitrariness. That's the only way that you can determine whether your worldview makes sense, which is something that unbelievers don't care to do because they cannot. Their worldview does not cohere internally, and it is full of arbitrary statements. Unsurprisingly, the only evidence he considered aligned with transmutation. Whoa, who would have thought that, huh? And the only interpretation he applied to his evidence also supported transmutation. What a surprise again. A naturally timid, non-confrontational man, he suffered severe digestive problems caused by the conflict he felt between Christian presuppositions regarding origins and his desire to be free of what he regarded as the shackles of Christian belief. Now listen, Charles Darwin received an undergraduate degree from Oxford University. Do you want to know what his undergraduate degree was in? Do you know what he studied? Religion. Yes. At that point, he had been training to become a pastor. He was never a believer, but he was training to become a pastor because he belonged to the non-titled upper middle class. His father was a doctor and apparently a fairly successful one. They had property and they were solid. In Germany, they would have been called burghers. In Hamburg, I don't know. They've been hamburgers? Oh, terrible pun. Bill shakes his head. Oh. He's alert. He's alert. Anyway, I can see that we've reached our time limit. I have much more to discuss about this. It's fascinating, and I got to tell you, look, before I go, I want to say this. The people who came up with dispensational premillennialism, they were not evil people seeking to undermine Christianity. They were products of their time. And because of the growth of rationalism in the Enlightenment and that kind of thinking of naturalistic humanism, they were being pressed on every side. And all of the respectable intellectual community had already abandoned the faith. They'd already chucked it out. Oh, they still went to church and they still maintained the forms of Christianity, but they didn't believe any of it. And so here you have these people who do believe, but the people they look to supply them with the intellectual ammunition to defend their faith had all turned away from them. So they've got to come up with a way of defending themselves. And frankly, they had no idea how to do it. So what they did is they essentially took off running, screaming and hollering, looking for a place to hide. Would I have done better at that time? Almost certainly not. So I'm not condemning those people. I'm not attacking those people. I am condemning the ideas that were wrong. And if I have wrong ideas, they ought to be condemned. Not me, but the ideas. That's why I'm always telling people, if you think I'm wrong, show me. Tell me. Because I don't want to be wrong. Okay? I want to be presenting God in all his glory. And if I'm wrong about anything I'm presenting, it's not God in his glory. It's error. Now, I don't want to be presenting error as if it were truth. But anyway, I want you to know that I don't regard myself as their superior, not at all. I'm standing on the shoulders of many, many other men, much brighter than me, much more courageous than me, who have lighted the way, and I'm walking down the path that they have brilliantly lighted up, and I'm trying to show you that same path. That's all. That's all. But, I'm sure that they're enjoying eternity with God in heaven because they served him as well as they could according to the light that they were given. But if we're given more light, then we need to serve him in another way. That's what we're talking about in our series here. At any rate, have a great rest of the weekend. And Bill, do you have anything you'd like to add? And remember, there are worse things than dying, and the very worst of all is to be unfaithful to God. God bless you. Sir?
See you Monday.
See you on Monday, yes.